Today I want to talk about a true pioneer in hip-hop, a legend actually, talking about Paul C. McKasty. Let's get into it. Paul C. McKasty was born September 20th, 1964 in the Rosedale section of Queens, New York. Paul developed an early passion for music. He had an older brother that was already immersed in the music scene in New York City, and therefore it rubbed off on Paul. Paul started heading in that direction. Early on, he picked up the bass guitar, and they said by the time he hit junior high, he was very gifted at playing the bass. At a very young age, 15, 16 years old. He was a bit young to be gigging with any bands or anything like that. But to his luck, a local band, local three-piece called the Mandolin Lee Roadshow was practicing one day and the bass guitarist didn't show up. So Paul got the call to come in and stand in for the bassist. Come to find out, he was nicer than their original bass player ever was. So he started gigging with the band. Their first show was at Max's Kansas City in New York. This was in August of 1981. This was during the final days of the venue. Fun fact though, the actual last show of Max's Kansas City was headlined by Bad Brains, and the openers was a very young Beastie Boys. But anyway, after Paul and them did the show, they started working on what would be their first and only album. Now, as the process started winding down as far as production and mixing the album and all, Paul wanted to be there for every aspect of it. He was highly intrigued by everything production, everything music. Now, fast forward a little while, Paul wound up getting a job at 1212 Recording Studio in Jamaica, Queens. Paul started rubbing elbows with a lot of local MCs, producers, even people that wasn't from Queens. He started doing sessions for artists like Super Lover C, Casanova Rudd, the Ultramagnetic MCs, Mikey D and the LA Posse, Steezo, Simply Too Positive, who would later on become Organized Confusion, as well as tons of artists. Now, Paul had a very good technique. He could make the thinnest breakbeat sound like it was on steroids. He was a master at layering these drum breaks with 808s, 909s, and just really thickening the drums up. Sort of similar to what Marley Marr did with MC Shan, The Bridge, and what he did with Impeach the President by using the 808, triggering the Impeach the President samples with the 808 drum machine and thickening it up as far as layering things. That's a good example if you want to go check that out. Anybody else has any other good examples of this technique, list them in the comments below. Now, Paul was very forward-thinking when it came to production. He tried things people didn't. He EQ'd hip-hop stuff the way rock stuff would be EQ'd. He added a lot of bottom to it. And this was the sound people were looking for. Some people didn't even know they were looking for this sound, but that was the golden sound. You check out any record Paul C touched back in the day, it's going to sound different than its contemporaries. And Paul developed a little technique which kind of was like, I think we all discovered this at some point, especially any of us who started like on the SP1200 or like Paul did on the SP12. That being a mono machine, you would feed both left and right into the mono input. So therefore, sometimes you might only have the left or the right going in. Maybe your wires weren't right or something, and you only picked up one side. Now, through this technique, Paul learned that some records, the drums would be completely panned, or the whole rhythm section would be completely panned, or the strings would be completely panned. So when it came to the D. Felice Trio song, There Was a Time, Paul knew the drums were isolated on the right-hand side. So Paul was able to grab them drums by themselves, which people didn't even think was possible. There's even interviews with Ultramagnetic talking about this technique and what Paul did with that record. Mainly Said G, he's the one, he talks about exchanging little ideas and secrets with Paul about the SP and the SP12 and the SP1200. Just bouncing stuff off each other like, yo, will you try this? Well, you can isolate the drums, blah, 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 blah. That type of stuff. We all do it, you know what I mean? But back then, stuff was a little more secretive. Now, people share ideas left and right. We got the internet and all. But back then, it was like a magician showing how he did his tricks. You just didn't do it. So a lot of Paul's techniques became mainstays in hip-hop production. And through making all these dope records and making this sound that a lot of people were after, Paul started rubbing elbows with the likes of the late, great, rest in peace, Biz Markie, Eric B. and Rakim. Like I said earlier, Steezo, rest in peace, Super Lover C, Casanova Rudd. All these great records, you know what I mean? All this great stuff either coming out of there or about to come out of there. Now, Paul got especially close with Eric B. and Rakim mainly. And them two started bouncing a lot of ideas off each other. Paul was letting Rakim hear ideas for beats, and Paul was giving Rakim like tapes of some, because Paul had a very extensive record collection. His record collection apparently was like legendary, and he took care of it. Like, we all have records, as you can see. I'm sorting. I got records piled up everywhere. Paul's records, they said, were immaculate. They even smelled clean, they said. Paul just really loved music, and he took care of his collection. So him and Rakim was finding a bunch of ill stuff. And all during this time, Paul had a protege, another dude named Paul. But you might know him as Large Professor. Now, we're talking like a 14, 15, 16-year-old Large Professor. And he's like a sponge. He's watching, listening. He goes to the studio anytime Paul invites him. Large Professor is there, absorbing everything. So a lot of projects Paul had coming up, he was bouncing the ideas off of Large. So Large knew a lot of the stuff that Paul had up here that didn't make it out yet. So fast forward a little bit, back to Rakim. Paul and Rakim are pretty much putting together what will become Let the Rhythm Hit 'Em LP. Now, there's much more to Paul's overall story. He did so much. He affected so many people. He touched so many people in so many ways. And his music just, it speaks for itself. He's done some amazing records. And a classic example of his studio wizardry is Ultramagnetic, Give the Drummer Some. So after you check this video out, go check that out, knowing what you know now, and listen to it. So in 1989, as Paul and Rakim are getting the ideas together for Let the Rhythm Hit 'Em, Large Professor is in the background, pretty much. Not at every turn, but at as many turns as possible. So he knows exactly what Paul's ideas are. So before anything actually becomes of this future Eric B. and Rakim album, Let the Rhythm Hit 'Em, on the night of July 17th, 1989, two men were seen entering Paul's house very late that night. Not that much later, two men were seen, the same two men, leaving Paul's house. That morning, it would be discovered that Paul was unalive that night, shot 3 times. Now, nobody knew what to think of the whole situation because Paul had no enemies. Everybody loved Paul. Who would want to end this man's life right when he is at the doorstep of greatness? They couldn't figure it out, but there was an eyewitness. The eyewitness would go on to pick out a dude named Derek Blair from a lineup as one of the assailants seen going into Paul's house that night. Derek was arrested in 1990, but due to lack of evidence, they had no choice but to let him go. Nothing stuck. There was nothing to hold him. No physical evidence. What are they gonna do? So sad to say, Paul's killers were never brought to justice. Now, shortly after the dust settled from the whole Paul C. unaliving, this Eric B. and Rakim album still had to be made. So who steps up to bat? No other than Large Professor, a very young Large Professor. He knew all Paul's ideas. He knew exactly what Paul had in mind for the Eric B. and Rakim album. So Large Professor, uncredited, finishes the album. And it's the album we know and love now. So go revisit that album and check on the back cover, and that white dude at the bottom, that's the man, Paul C. Now, there's been a lot of speculation over the years. I'm sure they've left no rock unturned. The wildest thing, and I ain't gonna say the wildest thing because I don't know the inner workings of that whole situation and everything, but Paul's wife, there was not just speculation, but there was rumors that Paul's wife was not happy with the money Paul was bringing in. And she believed he was making more than he was letting her know. Now, like I said, this is just speculation. This is just stories. But they said that her family could have had something to do with Paul's murder, but nothing ever materialized from that. Like I said, these are just theories. But to this day, we still don't know what happened, and we still don't know who did it. But I can say this, from hearing all the stories about Paul C. McKasty, that if he was still alive, there would be a shift in the upper players in the hip-hop genre. There can only be so many major players. And if Paul was still alive, then players probably would be shifted around and Paul would be amongst them somewhere. But as everybody agrees, Paul would be up there with the major players like the pre-Trouble Puffies, Dr. Dre's, the Premiers. And for the sake of his family and friends, hopefully one day the assailants will be brought to justice and Paul will be able to rest in peace. So on that note, that's the end of my little story about Paul C. There's much more to be learned about the man. He did so much in such a short period of time. He was only 2 months shy of his 25th birthday when he was taken from us. So he did all this amazing work in like 4 years, somewhere around there, like 4 or 5 years. He did all this. He has this amazing body of work. So yeah, definitely go check it out. They said Paul did a lot of things on handshakes. He wasn't a really like contract type of guy. So you might have to look at the labels to say, oh, Paul C. McKasty mixed and mastered or mixed and arranged this or produced this, whatever. But yeah, definitely go down, do a deep dive, go down the Paul C. rabbit hole, and I'm sure you will not be disappointed. And on that note, I'm going to take the time to say like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It really helps out the algorithm. And I will see you next time with some more stories, discussions, what have you. Salute.